The lawsuit arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly inside a certified envelope like it was doing me a favor. I almost tossed it aside, thinking it was another HOA warning about trash cans or paint shades. Instead, I stood in my kitchen reading words that made no sense at all: construction outside the approved HOA development zone. According to the Homeowners Association 3 streets over, my house, my legally built, county-approved home, wasn't supposed to exist where it stood. Worse, they claimed it blocked their scenic hillside view, and for that reason alone, they were suing me. I laughed out loud at first. Then I read the number at the bottom of the page. They wanted my house partially demolished. I'd lived on that land for 8 years. I bought it directly from the county, pulled permits through the city, and passed every inspection imaginable. The HOA had never once contacted me before the foundation went in, not when the framing went up, and not when the roof was finished. But suddenly, now that the house was complete and visible from their gated community, it was a problem. The letter accused me of willful disregard for HOA zoning authority, even though I had never signed a single HOA document in my life. I wasn't a member. I wasn't subject to their rules. At least, that's what I believed, until their attorney's letter said otherwise. The claim was bold. They argued that although my property wasn't inside their neighborhood, it fell within what they called a visual influence zone. According to them, anything built within sight of their homes required HOA approval. That's when the anger kicked in. I walked outside, stood on my porch, and looked toward their neighborhood on the hill. You could barely see their rooftops through the trees. Yet they insisted my house ruined the aesthetic integrity of their community. In other words, they didn't like looking at it, and they thought that gave them legal power over my land. Over the next week, things escalated fast. HOA representatives started driving by slowly, taking photos from the road. One afternoon, I caught a man with a clipboard standing near my fence line, pointing at my house while talking on the phone. When I confronted him, he calmly told me the HOA was confident the court would agree that my home violated their zoning rights. He even suggested I'd be better off settling early to avoid embarrassment. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a view. It was about control. I hired a lawyer the same day. When I showed him the lawsuit, he raised an eyebrow, then smirked. He asked one simple question: "Did you ever agree to be governed by this HOA?" When I said no, he nodded slowly and told me not to panic, but also not to underestimate them. HOAs, he explained, sometimes relied on intimidation and legal confusion to force homeowners into compliance, especially when they thought the homeowner would fold. What neither of them knew was that I had every permit, every survey, and every county map backing me up. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the HOA sent a final letter demanding I stop using the property in its current form. They even suggested the judge could order the top floor removed. I read that line 3 times, then looked around my living room, at the walls I'd built, the life I'd invested in. If they thought I was going to quietly tear down my own house because someone didn't like their view, they were in for a very rude awakening. But the real shock came when my lawyer uncovered why the HOA was so confident, and what they were hiding in their own zoning documents. The pressure started almost immediately after the court date was scheduled. What had begun as a ridiculous lawsuit quickly turned into a coordinated campaign to make me miserable. I started receiving letters every few days, some from the HOA's attorney, others directly from the HOA board. Each one sounded more confident than the last. They warned me about potential daily fines, court-ordered modifications, and even hinted that the county might revoke my occupancy permit. None of it made sense, but it was clearly designed to make me panic and fold before ever stepping into a courtroom. Then the unannounced visits began. One afternoon, I came home to find 2 unfamiliar cars parked across the street. As soon as I pulled into my driveway, the drivers rolled down their windows and began taking photos. When I approached them, they identified themselves as members of the HOA's Architectural Compliance Committee. They claimed they were documenting violations for the judge. I reminded them, politely at first, that my property was not part of their HOA. One of them smiled and said, "That's for the court to decide." That smile stuck with me. It wasn't confidence. It was arrogance. My lawyer wasn't impressed. When I forwarded him copies of the letters and photos, he told me this was a classic intimidation strategy. HOAs, he explained, often try to overwhelm homeowners with paperwork and fear, hoping they'll agree to a settlement just to make it stop. The HOA even offered one. They said if I paid a mitigation fee and agreed to plant tall trees to block my house from their view, they'd drop the lawsuit. It was extortion dressed up as compromise, and we both knew it. Things took a darker turn when I received a notice from the county zoning office. The HOA had filed a complaint claiming my home violated view corridor protections. The letter didn't accuse me of wrongdoing, but it did confirm that the county was reviewing the matter. For the first time, doubt crept in. What if there was some obscure regulation I'd missed? What if they really had found a loophole? I spent an entire weekend digging through my permit approvals, comparing them against zoning maps and planning documents, trying to find anything that could support the HOA's claim. That's when I noticed something strange. The HOA's development plan, filed years before my house was built, clearly outlined their authority boundaries. Their jurisdiction stopped well short of my property line. There was no mention of visual zones or view influence areas. Not in the county code. Not in their own documents. Yet in their lawsuit, they quoted language that didn't seem to exist anywhere official. When I pointed this out to my lawyer, he went quiet for a moment. Then he told me to send him everything. He said if they were misrepresenting zoning authority in court filings, that wasn't just weak, it was dangerous for them. Meanwhile, the HOA president made a mistake. She sent me an email meant for someone else. In it, she bragged that judges always side with HOAs, and that forcing me to modify my house would send a message to anyone else who thought about building nearby. That email changed everything. My lawyer told me to save it, back it up, and not respond. Intent mattered in court, and she'd just revealed theirs. This was never about a view. It was about power, precedent, and intimidation. As the hearing date approached, the HOA's tone shifted. The letters stopped. The drive-bys slowed. Instead, their attorney requested a private meeting to discuss options. My lawyer declined. He said we were past that point now. The evidence was stacking up, and the judge would want answers. Especially about where the HOA's so-called authority actually came from. And that's when my lawyer discovered the one document the HOA never expected us to find, something that could turn their lawsuit into a complete disaster. The document my lawyer found wasn't buried in some obscure archive or locked behind a paywall. It was publicly available, filed with the county clerk years ago and quietly ignored ever since. It was the original zoning and development map submitted by the HOA's developer when their neighborhood was first approved. And according to that map, their authority ended nearly 200 feet short of my property line. There was no buffer zone. No visual influence area. No special protection for views. On paper, the HOA had no legal connection to my land whatsoever. What made the discovery even worse for them was the date. The map had been filed before I purchased my property, before I applied for permits, and before construction began. That meant the county had already reviewed and approved my house with full knowledge of the HOA's boundaries. In other words, the system had worked exactly as intended. The HOA just didn't like the outcome. When my lawyer explained this, he smiled for the first time since the lawsuit began. "They're not just wrong," he said. "They're exposed." The hearing took place in a packed courtroom. A few HOA board members sat together in the front row, dressed sharply, whispering among themselves like they owned the place. Their attorney spoke first, confidently explaining that my home interfered with protected sightlines and violated established community zoning expectations. He used polished language, but every claim rested on that same imaginary authority. When the judge asked where those protections were codified, the attorney hesitated, just for a second, but it was noticeable. He cited HOA guidelines, not county law. Then it was our turn. My lawyer didn't raise his voice or dramatize anything. He simply handed the judge the zoning map, followed by my approved permits and inspection records. He explained calmly that I had never been a member of the HOA, never agreed to its rules, and never built on their land. The judge leaned forward, studying the map carefully. The room went silent. After a long pause, the judge asked the HOA attorney a question that made my stomach flip. "Can you point to any statute that grants your client authority beyond this boundary?" The attorney stumbled. He referenced case law. The judge cut him off and asked again, more firmly this time. There was no answer. The HOA president shifted in her seat. One board member avoided eye contact altogether. The confidence they'd walked in with was gone. The judge then asked whether the HOA had informed the court that their own file development plan contradicted their claim. That's when my lawyer introduced the email from the HOA president, the one about sending a message. The judge's expression changed completely. At that point, the judge ordered a brief recess. In the hallway, the HOA attorney approached my lawyer, suddenly much less aggressive. He suggested reconsidering settlement options. My lawyer declined. We had waited too long and endured too much for that. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge didn't waste time. He stated clearly that HOAs did not have the power to regulate non-member property based on aesthetics or views. He called the lawsuit deeply questionable and said the court would now consider whether it was filed in bad faith. The HOA tried to recover, claiming they were protecting community interests. The judge wasn't buying it. He scheduled a follow-up hearing, not to revisit my house, but to examine the HOA's conduct. Sanctions were now on the table. As we left the courtroom, the same board members who once stared me down couldn't even look at me. But the real humiliation for the HOA was still coming, because the judge wasn't done, and the final ruling would be delivered in open court. The weeks leading up to the follow-up hearing were eerily quiet. No more letters. No more drive-bys. No more thinly veiled threats from the HOA board. It was as if they'd collectively decided that staying silent might somehow undo what had already happened in open court. But silence doesn't erase records, and it certainly doesn't impress a judge. Behind the scenes, my lawyer was busy responding to subpoenas the court had issued, requests for HOA meeting minutes, internal emails, and any documents referencing so-called view protections. When those documents arrived, it became painfully clear why the HOA had panicked. In their own board meetings, they openly admitted they had no jurisdiction over my property. One email even referred to my land as outside leverage area, whatever that was supposed to mean. Another suggested that if they sued aggressively enough, I might settle to avoid legal costs. None of this was meant to be seen by a judge, but now it was all part of the official court record. My lawyer organized everything into a clean timeline that showed intent, knowledge, and deliberate misrepresentation. The day of the hearing, the courtroom felt different. Word had gotten around, and more people showed up, some from the HOA neighborhood, others from nearby communities dealing with similar overreach. The HOA board entered quietly this time, no confident chatter, no sharp suits. Their attorney looked tired. When proceedings began, the judge didn't ask for opening arguments. Instead, he addressed the HOA directly, asking whether they disputed the authenticity of the internal emails. Their attorney said they did not. The judge then read excerpts aloud. Slowly. Deliberately. Each sentence landed like a hammer. He highlighted phrases where board members acknowledged their lack of authority, then contrasted them with statements made in the original lawsuit. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. At one point, the judge paused, looked up, and asked the HOA president why the court hadn't been informed of these discussions. She tried to explain it as a misunderstanding. The judge stopped her mid-sentence and said, "This court does not confuse misunderstanding with misrepresentation." That's when the laughter happened. Not loud, not disrespectful, but unmistakable. Someone in the back let out a short chuckle when the judge described the HOA's visual influence zone as a concept with no basis in law, logic, or jurisdiction. Even the bailiff cracked a smile. The HOA attorney stared straight ahead, completely motionless. My house, the one they wanted altered or demolished, was never mentioned again. It was irrelevant now. The focus had shifted entirely to the HOA's behavior. The judge announced he would issue a final written ruling within days, but his intentions were already clear. He warned the HOA that courts exist to resolve real disputes, not to enforce aesthetic preferences on people who never agreed to be governed by them. He also stated that sanctions and attorney's fees were actively under consideration. The HOA attorney asked for a moment to speak. The judge denied it. As we left the courtroom, neighbors I'd never met shook my hand. One whispered that the HOA had tried something similar with her brother years earlier. Another said she hoped this would finally put a stop to the board's bullying tactics. I didn't feel victorious yet, but I knew the outcome was inevitable. Because when the final ruling arrived, it didn't just end the lawsuit. It destroyed the HOA's authority altogether. The ruling arrived on a Friday morning, emailed directly to my lawyer and copied to every party involved. I knew it was coming, but nothing prepared me for how brutally clear it was. The judge didn't hedge. He didn't soften his language. In the very first paragraph, he dismissed the HOA's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. My house, he wrote, was lawfully built, properly permitted, and entirely outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Any claim otherwise was unsupported by fact, law, or common sense. Then came the part that made my lawyer laugh out loud. The judge addressed the HOA's argument about my house blocking their view. He called it an unfortunate misunderstanding of property rights, and followed it with a line that would circulate through local legal circles for months. No individual or association is entitled to scenery at the expense of someone else's lawful property. In open court later that day, when the HOA attorney attempted to argue that community expectations should matter, the judge shook his head and actually chuckled. He told them views were not deeds, and preferences were not power. But the dismissal wasn't the end of it. The judge went further. He ruled that the HOA had acted in bad faith, knowingly misrepresenting its authority and attempting to intimidate a non-member homeowner into compliance. Because of that, the court ordered the HOA to pay every dollar of my legal fees, plus additional sanctions for wasting the court's time. The total amount was never announced publicly, but judging by the reaction at the defense table, it hurt. The HOA president didn't look angry. She looked stunned. Her attorney leaned in and whispered something urgent, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. The ruling explicitly stated that the HOA had no authority over any property outside its recorded boundaries, setting a precedent that would limit their reach permanently. Several neighboring homeowners would later use that same ruling to shut down similar threats. Within weeks, the fallout began. 2 board members resigned. The HOA quietly removed language from its guidelines referencing view protection. The president was voted out at the next meeting. And the letters, the threats, the drive-bys, they all stopped. Completely. My house, the one they wanted altered, hidden, or torn apart, stood exactly as it always had. The county closed its review with a single sentence, "No zoning violation found." That was it. Case closed. Standing on my porch one evening, I looked up toward the hill where the HOA neighborhood sat. My house hadn't changed. The view hadn't changed. What had changed was the balance of power. They thought they could control land they didn't own, enforce rules no one agreed to, and scare someone into submission. Instead, they ended up with a public ruling, a financial hit, and a reputation they couldn't undo. And every time I hear someone say, "You can't fight an HOA," I just smile. Because sometimes, the law laughs right along with you.